Last week, the Metatron made a video called "Are Viking Shield Walls Just a Myth?" This video was largely based on the research of Rolf Warming, who wrote his PhD thesis on whether or not shield walls were ever actually used in battle during the Viking Age. Now, unfortunately, I was unable to find this thesis online, but his main hypothesis is summarized in this online interview. Warming also reviewed the historical sources to find references to or descriptions of Viking shield walls. However, while the shield wall is mentioned in a few cases, the sources do not provide any description of the formation. Rather than being a special tactic, it seems to be more of a poetic term simply used to describe a large array of warriors, says Warming. The Metatron echoes this statement in his video and makes a point of any textual references to shield walls just being kennings and poetic devices rather than actually pertaining to a real formation.
Okay, let's begin with the literary evidence, because considering how ubiquitous the shield wall is in association with the Vikings in the media, you would expect at least one Viking to mention it, perhaps even tell us how it worked. Hey, even saying whenever we fought someone, we met the enemy in battle, then one of us would scream shield wall and everybody would go behind this interlocking round shield. No.
In this video, I'm going to tell you why I think they're wrong. Let's start off by looking at the Battle of Maldon, a poem that was recorded in the 11th century and composed in the Old English language, that is, the language of the Anglo-Saxons. The Metatron and Rolf Warming look more specifically at the Norse context, though they do mention the Old English corpus as well. I think it's worth bringing up the Old English material and that it's relevant and useful for several reasons. Firstly, Old English poetry has longer segments describing battles, providing greater contexts for events being described as opposed to shorter accounts in Old Norse poetry. Secondly, Old English poetry is recorded earlier than Old Norse poetry, and much of the Old Norse stuff is in an Icelandic context from much later on. The Anglo-Saxon and Norse worlds were closely related, however, so it's a reasonable inference that a style of fighting employed by one might also be true for the other. As I'll explore in this video, these are not being observed in a vacuum, and there is further evidence for similar fighting styles in surrounding cultures as well, which adds to the whole argument. It's also worth mentioning some of the pitfalls of using close analysis of poetry to extrapolate information about actual military formations and tactics. These poems aren't manuals for how to fight. In a largely oral society, there was no need for that to be written down, and so it wasn't. The battle poetry also isn't a description of exactly what happened in a given battle. The poets who composed the poems probably weren't at the battles and likely never actually witnessed one either. However, poetry can give us an insight into the idea of what a battle looked like and what the order of events was. The poets also weren't isolated, but they were members of their society and interacted with those who had seen battles and fought in them. The poems themselves were likely intended for the elite, who were expected to lead and fight, so these depictions are unlikely to be very erroneous given that context. With that said, let's get into the poetry. Almost at the start of the poem, we get a very interesting passage in which Byrhtnoth, or the commander of the English force, is clearly forming up his men and preparing them in formation for the coming battle. We read that he arranges his troops, but of particular interest is the stanza that mentions how he tells them how they should stand, and then how to hold their shields up properly. Now, to me, these lines suggest a clear link between the stance being taken, i.e. the positioning of the army, and the role of the shield, especially if the commander is telling the men exactly how he wants them to hold their shields up. The fact it is firm in their fists suggests to me that a defensive line is being made, where these shields are indeed locked into place, something which is again connected to where the men are being positioned. It's important to place the various references I'm mentioning here in a timeline of events to showcase at what stage in the battle they're being performed. The poem begins with the English and Viking armies, their words, not mine, on other sides of the Blackwater, or Panta in Old English, the stream. The English are waiting for the Vikings to cross, and Byrhtnoth is arranging his men. The Vikings then want to cross the stream and send a messenger who asks the English to let them cross so they can do battle on equal footing. Byrhtnoth, in his overmode, which probably means overconfidence, allows the Vikings to cross the stream but yields too much land. So we can imagine the English have stepped back and the Vikings are now on their side of the stream and the battle is ready to begin. Now this next section is one of the most crucial we'll be analysing, so I'm going to provide the Old English as well as the Modern English. Their onjean grammum, jero estodon, burtnodd mit beornum, he mit bordum het, wirchan thona Wighagan and that werod haeldan, faste with feondum. In his translation of the poem, Richard Hamers describes this as being, there Burtnodd and his warriors stood ready to meet their enemies. He told his troops to form a shield wall, here Wighagan, and to hold it against their foes. But seeing as we'll be doing a close analysis, I think it's more useful to provide a gloss. So I've translated this next bit word for word so we can see exactly what is happening here based on the Old English. So if we look here, we can see that it would say something along the lines of, there, against or opposite, the angry or fierce, ready stood Burtnodd with the warriors, he with the shields commanded to make the war hedge, Wighagan, and that army hold fast against the enemy. Now I'll quickly play this video by the Metatron again because I'll be specifically using this to critique it.
Even saying, whenever we fought someone, we met the enemy in battle, then one of us would scream, shield wall, and everybody would go behind these interlocking round shields.
Well, here we have Burtnodd directly commanding his soldiers to form the war hedge, which is most frequently translated to shield wall and which I'll cover in detail in just a second. The fact that whatever the war hedge is must be constructed with shields, as is clear from the fact that we see here that Burtnodd is commanding the soldiers to, with the shields, form this formation. Notice also the verb used to describe the shield wall. Wighagan is in the accusative case, which indicates that the verb pertains to making or constructing. This is the verb wurchan and is related to the modern English to work, as in to make something, to work something from metal, for example. Though in Old English, when it's found beside the accusative case, it means to make or construct something. And that something clearly has to be with the shields, and it's in preparation for contact with the enemy who have now crossed the stream and are ready to engage the English army. This can no longer just be described as a poetic construct or a kenning. Clearly, what is implied is that the Wighagan can physically be formed with shields, otherwise Burtnodd would not be the one commanding it to be made. We get a sense that these shields are being used defensively in just the next stanzas, where they're described as receiving spear points. So we can imagine it's being used as a defensive line based on the surrounding context and the way that the words have been carefully chosen by the poet. So let's take a little bit more of an in-depth look at the word Wighagan, or in its uninflected form, Wighaga. So this is a compound of two nouns, Wig, which means battle or war, and Haga, which means hedge or enclosure. Now, as I said, this is almost always glossed as shield wall in translations into English, but it's good to know what the actual bits of the compound mean. Now, if we're to take the stance that this is just a kenning or a poetic device rather than describing a kind of formation, the poet could have compounded Wig with any host of words. Old English poetry is alliterative, and this stanza's alliteration falls on the W of Wig, together with wirchan before and werod afterwards. So that Hagan bit, that suffix could have been anything added in as long as it fitted with the meter, and yet the poet chose to use Haga, and this is the only instance in all the Old English corpus that we get Wighaga. We don't find it anywhere else. So I think that this is a carefully chosen term by the poet, and I don't think it's arbitrary. Now, for more on this, actually, there's a really good article by Jeff Massey and Karma de Groy, who have written at great length about Haga compounds as they appear in Old English poetry. I'd highly recommend for you to read that for a fuller understanding, and there'll be a link to that below in the description, but I'd just like to summarize by reading a little section of their work. Further investigation shows that many Haga compounds carry martial connotations, and that Haga itself can describe the Anglo-Saxon shield wall formation composed of individual shield bearers arranged in a tight formation akin to that of a horticultural hedgerow. of course, to end the quote quickly, bearing in mind that haga can also be used as a kind of enclosure or a kind of hedge. It is actually the ancestor of the modern English word hedge. So, to return to the quote, ultimately, we should translate Anhaga as a lone hedge warrior or a solitary shield bearer, a designation akin to that of the hoplite, the shield-bearing Greek soldier who was defined by his particular defensive armame, his hoplon or shield, and his membership in the premier classical martial formation, the phalanx. Unlike the designation hoplite, however, to be named an Anhaga marked the separation of the single Germanic warrior from the comitatus, or more specifically from the Wighaga, thus signifying his isolation as a soldier without support, a one-man wall, a lone hedge warrior. The existence of Anhaga in itself suggests that the standard conception of combat was the haga, the hedge, the premier fighting formation that I believe is being described in the Battle of Maldon and elsewhere. We also have another word that comes up somewhat later in the poem, which is of interest. Here we read, Wende thas formoniman, tha he on mera rad, on walankan tham widje, that were hit urach laford, forthan weert her, on felda folk tot wemed, Skeldberg tobroken. Which means, when he rode on that horse, on that proud steed, full many a man thought it was our Lord. Thus our force was divided in the field, the shield wall, Skeldberg here, was broken. Now at the start of the poem, the English army have arrived on horseback, and then chased their horses behind the line as a symbol that they won't be retreating. Following the death of Burhnoth, one of his warriors called Godrich steals his fallen lord's horse and flees the field. Shock horror for the Anglo-Saxon audience, that is not done. This causes a panic among the men who believe that their lord is the one running away, and so they're left leaderless. This again gives the sense of the Skeldberg being a tangible object, as it can be broken, especially as the previous line mentions that the force is literally divided. So I believe this can be read as the line being broken following the apparent flight of their lord. Now, the word Skeldberg is again a compound of shield and burg, which that burg element means fortress or stronghold. So this is a cognate with the Old Norse construction Skeldberg, which the Metatron explains away as follows.
In the sources, this word is actually talking about a real formation used in battle. It's a completely different formation. Yes, it involves soldiers, troops, shields, but it doesn't represent the shield wall the way you think. It was a circular array of warriors, which was usually placed behind the main formation and designed to protect the king.
Now I realise that he is specifically talking about Skeldberg, about the Old Norse term, and I think I actually know where this explanation has come from. It's a passage in Heimskringla where there's a fight on a ship, and it does appear that they are forming some kind of defensive formation around the king in that passage. However, I don't think that works as an explanation for what we see here, and that possibly opens up the can of worms for other references to Skeldberg which are being explained away based on this one reference, if I am correct in thinking that that is where this explanation has come from. To return to Maldon, the reason I don't think it works is that, for one, the leader of the force is already dead. Burhnoth has been killed at this point, so it makes no sense to form a ring around the king or the leader because he's already dead. We also have no indication that the English have been surrounded at this point, as Godrich just moments earlier is easily able to escape on his late master's horse, and we get no indication that he struggles in doing so. The force is also described as being divided, which again to me points to them being arrayed in a line and not some kind of circular formation where that's harder to explain. We get a similar idea from another Old English battle poem, this time recorded in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, called the Battle of Brunanburg. Here we read, Umbe Brunanburg, Bordwell Klufan. So around Brunanburg they broke the shield wall, here Bordwell. Now again, we get a sense here that the Bordwell can be broken, which to me suggests we are again dealing with a tangible formation and not a more vague sense of battle or collection of warriors because they continue to fight. So the verb klufan, which is often standardized in Old English as kleofan, again implies cutting or splitting, which to me suggests a line being cut or split. Again, the line alliterates on the B, so the poet could have chosen any verb here to use. So I think this isn't being chosen by accident, but that it's being used with that imagery in mind and to create that image in the heads of the listeners or the readers. So the compound bordweal can be broken into two parts. Again, bord is another word for shield, and whale is wall. It's quite literally the ancestor of the modern English word wall. And this exact compound is also found in the poem Beowulf, where we read, Sean higelakes freothowong dhone forth offereodon, siddan rethlingas to hagan thrungon. The standards of Hygelac overran that place of refuge after the Threlings thronged the shield wall or rampart, which is described as the Haga. So here it's not entirely clear if we're dealing with a physical rampart, a fortification wall made, or a wall made of shields, a shield wall, though it does again establish that connection between Haga and a kind of wall, an actual physical barrier or formation. Later, we do get a mention of a shield wall a few stanzas later, where we read Brekan ofer bordweal, which means broken over the shield wall, again, bordweal. And in this reference, this is a reference to Ongen Theo, who is one of the warriors whose helmet is broken and then hangs over the shield wall. And there are other instances where we come across shield wall compounds as above, including quite a few more in Beowulf. We also find them in the poems of Elen and in Judith. They also crop up. And there are some allusions to battles happening in tight formation in prose as well as in poetry, but these are very subject to interpretation and are very short and mentioned in passing without context, making it much harder to analyze what exactly they mean and are saying. But I'll mention the ones that we do have. In Asser's biography of Alfred the Great, he's a contemporary of his, he notes how the English army in the Battle of Edington in 878 fights cum densa testudines, which in Latin means in close order. Now, of course, what's really interesting about this is that he uses the word testudo, which is the Roman formation that the shield wall is sometimes compared to. Having said that, it's difficult to know if he uses this word with that actively in mind or not. To find out, we'd probably have to check which Latin texts were commonly in circulation at that point in both Wales and in Wessex, and whether there are any mentions of this formation by name, and whether Asser might then have learnt about the Roman formation of testudo and then also applied it to the Anglo-Saxon warriors, or whether this is a general reference to fighting in close order. Either way, that does seem to point towards, rather than necessarily positively mentioning, that they are fighting in a tight formation close together. But it's still interesting, but as I said, very much up in the air and open to interpretation. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, they also mention that in battle the two sides are locked together in combat, but again, that might be rather more a poetic way of saying it rather than a specific marker of a tight formation being employed. Finally, just as an example that these fighting techniques weren't occurring in a vacuum, we get another interesting passage of poetry, this time from the Brythonic world, either from Wales or from Cumbria in the northwest of England, but it's written in Middle Welsh. So here we read,
Dia hafwn eis doedd oddwch minis, ac amporthwn wyneb oddwch emil, a dia hafwn pelaidia oddwch penguir.
Now, more eagle-eyed listeners will have noticed that that wasn't in fact me speaking, because my Middle Welsh is not up to snuff, but in fact James Combe, who has studied medieval Welsh, although he's more of a Germanicist. So if you are looking for anything translated into or from Old English, Old Norse, Gothic, or Old High German, then check out the link in the description below, because my good friend James is in fact available for translation services at very reasonable prices. So do check it out in the description below. He went to Cambridge. He did the same course that I did, and I can vouch for his services and his quaint Yorkshire twang. And a thank you to James for helping me with the pronunciations of the medieval Welsh here. But to return to this poem, this is from a medieval Welsh poem, and the passage that you just heard means, high on the hilltop, let's raise our ramparts, carry our faces over the shield rims, raise up our spears, men over our heads. And again, that does sound a little bit like we're talking about some kind of formation, again with shields, with spears being used over the top of these shields. And so we have yet another piece of potential evidence. So in brief, what does this suggest in total about the usage of shield walls in Old English poetry? As I mentioned already in the discussion, the way the Anglo-Saxon poets describe these words to me does suggest they are talking about something more than a poetic sense or a broader kenning, and not specifically a kind of circular formation that's formed at certain times to protect the king. The way they are described makes it clear that they can be split, and other descriptions make it clear that objects and people can go over and lie under the formation. In the next section, I'd like to briefly showcase some of the pictorial and epigraphic evidence for shield walls as well. So first of all, let's take a look at the Bayeux tapestry, because on this tapestry we have this very famous image. These are the Anglo-Saxons standing on the top of Senlac Hill being attacked by the Norman cavalry, and indeed here we have a depiction of shields overlapping. Now of course these are kite shields, these are the ones that the Normans were using, and that we know that in the later period of the Anglo-Saxons they also were using kite shields as well, but this does indeed look to be an overlapping formation of shields with several warriors actually out in front, which is something interesting because we get a sense of that in the Waldere poem as well. But I don't quite have time to go into that as this will already be a very lengthy video. But if you are interested in that, I will link an article below which talks about that. Another piece of evidence that we might have for a pictorial reference or an epigraphic reference to a shield wall is from a hogback stone. These are stones that are shaped sort of like mini churches that are found very often in the northwest of England, where a lot of Scandinavians came and settled. This particular one is from Gothic and is believed to be in a Scandinavian context. And on this stone, we can see here that quite clearly are depicted a row of warriors with shields. Now what's interesting is that we can also see the spears. There is a figure in the middle who appears to be holding a spear out to the side, but what's quite interesting is that the other figures don't seem to be holding spears sort of straight with the butt on the ground, but rather to be holding the spears in a kind of overhand grip. And that sounds quite a bit, or looks quite a bit, like the description we had in that Welsh poem which we ended with the spears on high over their heads over the wall of shields. So that again is quite interesting and might be another piece of evidence that we can consider in favor of there indeed being overlapping shields, as quite clearly they overlap, and this is actually from a Scandinavian context, which links it once again to the Norse world. Finally, almost finally, I'd like to look at a bit of the tapestry from the Oseberg ship burial, which is 9th century from Norway. And here we can see in this corner that we have quite clearly a row of warriors and what appears to be shields with the bosses in the middle, once again in a row, in a line, overlapping. And so again, I would suggest that perhaps this is showing a shield wall with these overlapping shields on this tapestry. And finally, I'd like to show part of a lyre that was found in Tuttlingen in Germany. It's called the Trossingen lyre, most frequently in English. And again, on that lyre, actually, we see quite a similar depiction here with warriors also holding either spears or swords and with a row of shields. Now, possibly we're looking at 2 rows of warriors that is going on there, but again, that does look an awful lot like how we imagine a shield wall might have looked. And so I thought it was relevant to bring these up because, as at least in Metatron's video, these weren't discussed, and as I said, I didn't have access to the entire thesis, so perhaps these have been discussed and that Warming has another explanation for these, but I thought these were good to bring up in this discussion as well. In this final section of the video, I'd like to talk about psychology and what might be termed the culture of warfare. Because there were a few factors that weren't really looked at all when discussing whether shield walls made sense or not. Now, this probably should get its own video because there's actually a lot to go into here, so I'll try and summarize quickly. Morale is a very important factor when it comes to combat, especially when you're not dealing with only professional soldiers who want to be there and who are trained to fight, but also with large bodies of men who were conscripted or did not want to be there. For individuals that aren't particularly well trained in combat, I would suggest that this kind of formation, where it is more defensive a lot of the time and where teamwork is easier than in an open formation, I would suggest that this does actually have quite a few benefits for fighting in this way. Now, another thing to note is how frequently we find these kinds of formations in the ancient and medieval world. We've already looked at the phalanx before. There is the Roman testudo, which, yes, of course, different shield shape, which does indicate different usage as well. But nonetheless, we know that there were Germanic auxiliaries that fought with the Romans and had a similar-ish, don't kill me, kind of shield shape as later on in the Viking Age. So we know that they were in contact with peoples that were using similar kinds of formations. As we saw from the Welsh poem, it's possible that they were using something similar. As I've argued throughout this video, there are very many similarities between the Anglo-Saxon world and the Norse world, and in the Anglo-Saxon world, we do actually have a lot of references, and I would argue quite conclusive references to these formations being used. So actually, if they weren't using this kind of formation, they would be more the odd ones out in this part of the world because so many peoples were using it. Finally, to end on a note about the culture of warfare as I've termed it, I think one problem with some experimental archaeology that we find is that we approach this with the mindset of a modern person. A lot of the time, and this isn't a fault, actually I think it's a great praise to people like Rolf Warming, and I think his research is really interesting, and this isn't to discredit that, but rather to provide other sort of angles from which to look at this problem, but that we approach this with a very functionalist point of view. We do tests on these weapons, we do tests on these shields, and we conclude there was a better way of doing it, hence they didn't do it in this way because they could have done it in this way, which makes more sense and which passes the tests better. However, that's not necessarily how people in the past thought. We might, for example, think to the 18th century, when the method of fighting was lining up really quite close to another line of guys with muskets and having at each other. Now, of course, from sort of modern military doctrine from today, if we look back, we think, why aren't they using cover? Why aren't they bunching up? And of course, there are technological factors that play into this, like the inaccuracy of the musket. But even when the rifle was invented, it took quite a while for that transition to occur. And actually at the start, riflemen were seen as kind of being a little bit under the normal musketmen because they broke the rules of engagement. Now, of course, Viking Age conflict is very different to this period of conflict with musketry. However, I think the key that I'm trying to point out is that there is a certain culture of warfare. There are accepted norms, and even if there are safer ways of doing things, there were easy ways for these men not to have had so many casualties in battle, this was the norm of doing it, and often that was just how they did it. Even more so in the Viking Age world than in this period, honor was hugely important. Being called a coward or the insinuation that you wouldn't stand and fight was a huge dishonor that could and did lead to violence. We already saw in the Battle of Maldon, and yes, this is a poetic depiction, but the poetry speaks of the culture of the time. We saw there that the English commander, instead of obviously keeping the Vikings on their island and so having his advantage over them, he allows them to cross the stream so that they have a more equal footing against the English to then do battle. And I think there are some interesting parallels. I think, is it the Battle of Fontenoy when the English commander or the British commander invites the French to shoot first? This kind of thing comes up a lot of the time, and from a modern military perspective, although there are elements of that still, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense. There are better ways of doing it, we think, in our rational way of thinking. However, that wasn't always the main driver. It was a driver, but it wasn't always the main driver in the past for these forms of warfare. And it's possible that even though, yeah, you can argue there are better ways of forming up and of using shields and things than building a shield wall, that might just have been the norm for things to be done that way, even if there were other, arguably, maybe not, better ways of forming that up. Anyway, I don't know if that made much sense. This is an idea that I've had in my head, so I thought I would share it here. Might be a little bit similar to the fact that with these spectacle helms, it's often said these actually tend to gravitate spears towards the eye sockets, and so they weren't particularly effective helmets, so we don't know why they used them. It might be something similar there, that, you know, that the functionality of it wasn't the only consideration that was being considered for its use. A final point about the testing method that's being used. Now, please bear in mind, this is based on a video that I saw with Rolf Warming that was posted on YouTube of the testing going on. This might not actually have been the ones that were in combination with his thesis, and if so, then I apologize and feel free to disregard what I'm about to say. But if it was, it looked very much like these tests were being done with a sword repeatedly hacking into a shield, sort of with two guys, so one-on-one. That's very different to actually a shield wall style of combat, if you think about it. I'm not sure how many strikes a particular warrior would be able to get in at the same spot before he's picked up by a buddy in the opposite line who has seen him constantly making that attack and puts in a strike by himself. So I think if that is the kind of testing method, I don't think that's going to be particularly useful, because yes, of course, if you consistently whack a shield in the same spot with a sword, you are going to split it. The question is, in an effective shield wall, does the enemy warrior have the opportunity to do that without himself being apprehended and killed by the shoulder warrior, to use that Old English compound, of the guy whose shield he is whacking? A final point, again, is that a lot of these tests seem to either be with big axes or swords, which, fair enough, they were absolutely used on the battlefield, but a lot of the weapons being used would be spears. We even get Byrhtnoth in the Battle of Maldon. He fights with his spear for quite a while before pulling his sword, and he is the leader of the force. So that, to me, suggests that spears are actually the main weapon that we would be finding on the battlefield. And with a spear, it's quite a lot harder to split a shield and might not actually be what you want to do, because if you get your spear lodged into an enemy shield, you can no longer use your spear. So, just some final thoughts there, and if that is not the testing method, then, as I said, then this is dross, and feel free to ignore it, but I thought I would include it just at the end anyway. Alright then, if anyone is still here at this point, then thank you very much for watching this video and for sticking through to the end. I hope this was somewhat interesting, and I would be really interested to hear in any feedback that you have. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that the shield wall looked markedly different? Something I didn't really talk about that potentially I should have is defining exactly what is a shield wall. There are various depictions of it in media and indeed ideas about it in history, and a good question is, did they conceptualize this as a very specific thing, or was it more a kind of line of men that were using their shields in an overlapping fashion to protect themselves? That's what I think is borne out in the sources, but that essentially is what we mean by shield wall, which is why I disagreed with the conclusion that there is no evidence to suggest that there were shield walls, or that can be explained away, because that is what I mean when I mean a shield wall. Which reminds me, if anyone is interested in any sort of shield wall themed merch on a t-shirt, I thought that the row of shields with the floating helmets and weapons looked kind of cool, and I could maybe do a few variations with a more Anglo-Saxon looking line and maybe some more Viking looking lines, or a Celtic line, even something like that. Let me know in the comments below if that is something you would be interested in, and I can pop up a design on the Teespring and you can support the channel in that way. Anyway, in the meantime, I have been Hilbert and this has been The History.